This has kind of been a kind of long running project now. And to be honest, I feel like I've been going on about this for a number of years. And I'm sure there are quite a few people here. I saw Angela, poor Angela, here today, who'll be sighing and thinking, oh God, not her, harping on about this again. And to those people, I apologize. But I feel for those who may not have come across this before, my project with Jenna Ward, who's actually not at Leicester anymore, but is now at Coventry University, was based around this essential empirical question, which emerged out of discussions that we had with volunteer coordinators and the head of volunteering and participation at the National Trust, which was, to what extent is the management of volunteers similar or different to the management of paid staff? And this came about because of a number of issues that the Trust was finding in terms of some difficult relationships and kind of persistent problems. And I'm just going to kind of skip through this so that I can get to the main point, but we conducted research at both the National Trust, who've become our real like co-production partners. It's been perhaps the most kind of rewarding research relationship I've experienced in my 20 years academic career. And then we also did a replication study at the City of London Open Spaces. We were specifically interested in contexts where there were mixed paid staff and volunteer contexts, so rather than volunteer-run organisations, and more specifically where managers were paid, i.e. controlled by the wage-labour relationship, while volunteers were not, leading to what we deemed to be quite a difficult emotional landscape. I suppose key findings: managing effectively committed volunteers is emotionally challenging work, and I'll come to that later, and that managing and working with emotions is and should be a key volunteer management skill. So we managed to get something published in the NVSQ in 2018, and I suppose the theoretical and analytical background to this was that characteristics of a paid employment relationship are often applied to the management of volunteers. And one of the things that we discuss in that article is that there's actually an overriding trajectory of the transplantation of for-profit logic into non-profit context, with a working assumption being that the management of volunteers is the same as the management of paid staff. And so therefore what you see in quite a lot of organisations is that policies and procedures, for example, around recruitment and selection, training and development, a number of HR initiatives, and in fact sometimes shared HR departments, indicate a clear pressure for non-profit organisations to behave like private organisations. And we witness this both within the sector itself, but also within practitioner literatures. At the really interesting Building Bridges seminar a couple of years ago, I know there's been one since, the last thing I ever went to physically was the Building Bridges event in London in March. But a couple of years ago, one of the things that Justin Davis Smith identified as a continuing research gap is this kind of interrogation of that black box of paid manager volunteer relationships. And that's really what Jenna and I have tended to focus on in our research thus far. I would say that critical research on emotions and affect in the voluntary sector is scarce but growing. And I think we notice as well a particular proscription of the negative and ignoring of the dark side. People don't like to talk about things that don't work with those relationships, or how they might be difficult or challenging. And it kind of counters the general feeling in the sector of needing to be positive and give rewarding experiences and be that type of person. And that's what we really cover within that NVSQ article. When we looked at the empirical research, we think that our findings do challenge that prevailing trajectory, the operationalisation of the management of volunteers as paid staff. And we did find significant differences in 5 main areas. And while we found differences around performance management systems, communication processes, and task differentiation, what we've really focused on has been these emotional aspects, the notion of affective commitment, and the challenges of managing a volunteer workforce that's very affectively committed. We've tended to focus on these emotions aspects of our findings because they came out so strongly as a real difference in what it felt like to manage volunteers, and that really emotional, strong relationship between managers and volunteers. Okay, so our project was kind of, it had an arts-based methodology as well, so we used quite a lot of drawings, and I don't. These are drawings from volunteers, and the overall, I won't go on too much here, is that volunteers in the National Trust and in the City of London were highly affectively committed to their local spaces. I mean, the real embodied love, passion for that space, and it kind of overrode almost anything else about their commitment to the cause. It was really about that to their local space. And that led to extremely strong feelings, which were regularly and frequently voiced. We also found that their managers too were affectively committed, and their love of space was demonstrated through strong desires and passions. You know, here we've got planting out the parterres and the terraces, pruning ancient apple trees, opening shutters, uncovering furniture, finding a hidden diary entry, and they like this myriad of images and experience that were evoked by many of the managers in their interviews and also in photographs that we asked them to take. However, compared to paid to volunteers, that affective commitment was not often expressed openly, and it was often tempered by a focus on targets, rotas, which we have the picture of the rota there, that someone took as the overriding aspect of their job was this rota, and operational objectives. And so we began to get kind of disjunctures between managers and volunteers around that open expression of commitment to love and love of space and place. So on the one hand, so we're looking in particular, what's the impact of effectively committed volunteers on a managerial task? And on the one hand, it's definitely a good thing. It's what every kind of commercial organization would dream for, you know, that holy grail of how do you get people to work, to just be committed to the organization? Well, volunteers, you've got it in spades. And a good thing, if you've got volunteers that are really engaged, really involved, love the place, feel valued, they go out and they don't only just get more volunteers, they're brilliant advocates for us. So there was a real recognition of how important and useful and valuable affectively committed volunteers were. But there's also that it can be too much of a good thing, which is the kind of tenor of our article. There's a couple of quotes there. You're faced with what seems like an army of people. When they're en masse, they feel the power together. It became very daunting and intimidating for managers. And some of them said, the volunteer management part of my job is the worst part of it. I find it the most difficult. In particular, we identified unique emotional challenges posed. Volunteers motivated by a deep emotional attachment to the place, people, or organisation they're tasked with helping will also mean that at times, and for very good reasons, volunteers were resistant to change. They could be very non-compliant. They were more likely to publicly criticise managers or organisational policy, and were very much less concerned about regulating their own emotions. So while it's acknowledged that this passion is ultimately very valuable, and these behaviours were nonetheless quite difficult to manage. For managers, directing and coordinating those without an employment contract can be very daunting and intimidating. The high dependency on volunteers, coupled with a perceived lack of control, meant that many managers felt impotent, and this had negative concomitant effects on team well-being, effectiveness, and the ability to achieve organisational objectives. Having done this research and coming up with these findings, we then worked with the National Trust to have a number of organisational interventions. And these interventions were designed to both improve specific skills, practices and processes involved in managing affectively committed volunteers, and to create an environment in which these challenges could be spoken about more openly. So, for example, there were elements to this here: a review and revision of existing training provision for managers. And the National Trust obviously has perhaps one of the most sophisticated training provisions for volunteer managers that exists in the sector. working group activities across 17 and 18 to develop in-team interventions to help managers and their teams. In particular, this Working with Emotions toolkit that we've developed, that was rolled out in 6 properties as a pilot September 2019, just before COVID in March 2020. And it was meant to be rolled out nationally in July, but of course that has been, scuppered. There's also a broader project that we work with the Everyone Welcome strategy, led by colleagues in museum studies at University of Leicester, which we're involved with, which also takes on board some of these emotional aspects. We're hoping that in the longer term, this will lead to some kind of our aspirations, I suppose, for personal potential impact. And anyone who's involved at a UK institution and preparing for the REF currently, this is being taken forward as one of Leicester's impact case studies. So I'm kind of completely in the middle of it at the moment. But we're hoping that it will lead to more informed and prepared volunteer managers, got their communicative and effective relationships. Really importantly, hopefully less incidents of difficult encounters, with concomitant less need for remedial resources, and perhaps more resilient and effective volunteer teams. Our research findings, it's really nice to have, that's been one of the wonderful things working on this project, has been to see some of the things feeding through from research into policy aspects. And I think there has been organisational culture change demonstrated through acceptance of the crucial importance of emotions management as a skill in managing volunteers at the National Trust. This has been seen, I think, at a new acceptance that managing volunteers can be challenging and difficult, but this needs to be talked about rather than ignored. Moving beyond just the volunteer management area, there's a broader recognition of the importance of managing emotions and, importantly, of engaging volunteer voice in order to facilitate more effective change processes and more resilient property or site teams. Emotions management and the concept of affective commitment, there's loads of references to affective commitment in National Trust documents now, is now embedded into how the Trust thinks about volunteer and volunteer managers' relationships. It's included in many pieces of guidance and policy, and I've given some examples there. Courageous conversations, a practical guide for anyone needing to have potentially difficult conversations with volunteers. Exploring Everyone Welcome, which is about inclusive practice. Involving volunteers in national public programmes, which is a guide to support places when planning and delivering key national art and heritage programmes. And as recently as June, the People Guidance Pack for COVID-19 for the Trust, a regularly updated one-stop shop for all people managers. There's evidence of the acceptance of core research findings also in the wider voluntary sector, and I have a quote there from someone outside of the organisation, across a variety of types of organisation and service provision. And many organisations have indicated that the various places in which we've been going out and delivering this, often facilitated by the Trust, who are very open to people sharing the research findings and the learning. In changes to training policy and guidelines elsewhere. There's also, I think the training has been really important. Findings from our critical review have led to the redevelopment of existing materials, in particular, a completely new foundations programme for volunteer managers. And we've been trying to track some of the feedback. So I thought that's quite a nice quote from a participant in the latest round of that foundations training. I learned about strong emotional attachments volunteers can have with National Trust properties and how this can both be a positive and a negative, and so on. And outside the Trust, we've also had documented changes in policy at other organisations, completely changing leadership courses as a consequence of the dissemination of the research. I think what's really been important at the Trust has been that being more responsive to volunteer voice as one of our key recommendations has been taken on board really strongly. So in terms of the new value service principles of the Trust, the visitor's journey framework, and so on. I'm very aware that I have 3 minutes left, Vita, so I'm going to skip through. And And so kind of our kind of both, I think the active intervention that I suppose I'm most proud of has been the working with emotions in volunteering toolkit. And this is its kind of new graphic kind of design, which is being disseminated to the pilot properties. And it's kind of a novel intervention that provides a set of hard copy and online resources that property teams can use to help their individual and team thinking and practice. The resources could be used for planned training purposes, reflective exercises, or for in-the-moment crisis assistance. So you've had a really bad experience, you go and find something in the toolkit that will help you to try and cope with that or deal with it. And as far as we're able to see from surveys, there has been a kind of an increase in confidence with regard to dealing with some of these things. There's obviously 5 sections to the toolkit, and some of it is really about thinking about your own emotional responses to situations, as well as thinking and learning to cope strategies, as well as really trying to put things in perspective. And this is me trying yesterday to, well, when I write day before yesterday, trying to photograph the toolkit so I could put it on images, but to give you some of the ideas of some of the activities that are within that toolkit. So, you know, starting from volunteer management as a kind of profession and as your job within the trust, and what you're sometimes expected to do, and like, that's not in my job spec, and like having activities around some of those things. And I think it's quite interesting here, the activity here, if you look there, the second bit, read these phrases below. I know it's not okay that he said this thing or did this thing or acted in this way, but he's a volunteer, he's giving up his time for free. I don't like being shouted at by volunteers, but I'm paid to take that, to be honest. And then a kind of our view was, well, is that right? Is that in your job spec? Should that be the reaction? And so on. Yeah, about keeping things in perspective, what we tended to find was a really strong emotional reaction to something, a bad experience would mean that everything about your job seemed bad. And that kind of was an overriding tendency amongst our volunteer management teams. And that actually some of the activities were around, okay, let's try and get that in perspective and try and work out whether or not it really is the status quo, or that, you know, you can think about things in a more positive way. Activities around actively demonstrating your love of place. One of the big disjunctures between volunteers and volunteer managers was that managers didn't openly express their love of place. And so we were trying to engage in some activities that would allow them to think about ways they could do that, to actually perform the emotional labor of expressing emotion, which didn't necessarily come naturally, particularly when you've got a whole myriad of activities that you would like to be involved in. I suppose our future focus now is that my real dream, and at the time, and I know in March that I was speaking at the time to Ruth Leonard at the Association of Volunteer Managers, that we would be able to convert this toolkit into something much more generic that could be delivered to the sector for free. And at the moment, the kind of COVID pandemic and everything has really kind of scuppered those plans. But it's still a real aspiration of mine, and hopefully something that we can write up. But because the feedback that we've had about the toolkit has been overwhelmingly positive, and I think there's some work to be done in how that might work in contexts outside of the National Trust, but I think there is the capacity to develop a generic version that could be really useful to people. I don't know whether in the effect of the pandemic there will be declining investment or declining concern in some of these areas, which for me is personally worrying, given I think that it was so important in why things worked or didn't work in the trust. I mean, certainly many of the trust, I mean, the trust is going through a time like universities are in terms of staff being furloughed, staff being made redundant, and squeeze resources. So we will see. But I probably just, sorry, that's kind of a whip through. There we are of the research. And I'm really, really happy to talk to anyone about it. Send you information about the toolkit if you think it would be interested. And if I could have any kind of view about whether a generic toolkit would be useful to people, I would love to hear it, because I think we do have the capacity, I think, to actually design that and get that going.